but that's
Oh, you can begin now. They're here, apparently.
No? Good to know.
Snacks are in. We are ready.
Have you noticed all the inquiries from the Cape Falls area?
Open a can of worms there, buddy.
I actually had connection with.
Isn't that his job to do that?
Testing. Can you hear me? Good. Good. Test. 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 All right, we're at 4 o'clock. I'll start the colloquium here with a quick introduction of our speaker today. Liz Becker is a misplaced Midwesterner.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
She's originally from Michigan, and if you've ever driven through that area, it's you don't think about it very often, but the upper peninsula and the upper part of Michigan is really a beautiful area. Lots of hardwoods. The falls are incredible, and the winters are not to be tolerated, unless you like to ski and ice skate and all those other things. She has a bachelor's from Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, my.
That stands for Michigan, Steve.
I know it does, but it sounded good.
Okay.
She's been working as a teacher for quite a while, both in Michigan and then in Wyoming, and now working here at EOU, running the core program or teaching core classes. She has a master's degree from Eastern in education, specifically literacy education and reading. I've had the great pleasure to work with Liz for a few years on the Summer Institute for Instructional Technology, or SIT. We had a great time putting that course together, and I see some of our alumni
Yay.
here from SIT. She's also put together the little free library. There's one over in Hoke.
Zabel.
Excuse me. No,
Loso.
Loso. The first
Hoke.
one on campus
On
was
Hoke.
in Loso. And then at the prompting of a faculty member in Zabel's, I said, gee, why don't we put one here in Zabel? And Liz was very helpful in helping me put that together. So there's one over on the second floor outside the Learning Center in Loso, and there's one on the second floor, Zabel, in the little student lounge. And I see books coming and going on a regular basis.
As of last week, we had over 500 to go out of the LOSO one
Wow.
since it started last year. So
That's really good.
We're very
Those-
excited.
those are- There's a couple, Carol Lawrenson has one in her front yard, if
Yep.
you've ever seen that little house that she has on her front. So with that introduction, I want to add one last thing, because then we'll, after Liz presents, we'll go to questions. This is our last colloquium for the year, if I understand correctly, yes? MJ, Rory? And I'd like to leave you with a question. What should colloquium be? And I'd like you to respond if you feel compelled to either Rory or me. What should colloquium be? We have a good turnout today. Not every session turns out a fair number of people. And it seems like attendance has kind of fallen off in the last few years. What should it be? Should it continue? If so, in what form? We've been asking for input like that for last 3 or 4 months and trying to gather up some idea. Rory and I are the people that coordinate this, and we want to know where to go next year with it. So your input would be very, very appreciated. With that, I'll turn it over to Liz. She's going to talk about in-person or online literacy education. Thank you.
thank you. I feel like I need to come way over here now. Everybody's way far in the back, but I'll back up a little bit. So today, this is about a study that I've been working on for the past 3 years, and I'm going to go through these particular pieces of it in a little bit more detail. Feel free to ask questions at any point. Conversation is better than, just me talking at you, so feel free to discuss. So the nature of the study, first of all, large issues to be examined. So this is something you guys are probably familiar with. College retention rates in the United States, on average, or graduation rate, is about 55%. And here at EOU, somewhere around 43%. Those numbers I know fluctuate. So that is something that, especially in my job and what I do, my job is all about retention. That's what I do. That's the purpose of my position. So this is something I think about a great deal. Specifically freshmen, because I work exclusively with freshmen. In the United States, the average freshman retention rate from fall to fall is about 77%. Last year at EOU, as some of you know, it was 56% here. So this is an issue, of course, I've been looking at over the course of my years here at EOU. The program that I work in with CORE, students are placed there based on reading, writing, and math. This study looks specifically at reading and writing, and of our incoming freshmen every year, about anywhere in the range of 20% to 33% of our incoming freshmen have low reading and writing skills. So that's important for us to look at and try to find ways to address. So literacy skills are very connected to college persistence. Most significant predictor of college success is the ability to read complex texts. If students can't read what they're being given in class, they're not going to do well in class. And unfortunately, only about 50% of high schoolers graduate with the skills they need to be successful in college when it comes to literacy. So when we talk about this, the specific literacy skills we're talking about include strategic reading, the ability to critically interact with texts, background knowledge, summarization, main idea identification, and metacognitive skills, or thinking about what they're reading, reflecting on how well they're understanding that. So the particular place where I did the research, for on-campus students, there's a lot of blended learning that goes on around campus, so kind of helping students in that area. And there's a significant number of developmental reading and writing students. And of course, there's the online students. A large number of EOU students are online, and that's kind of a growing number. Sometimes, hopefully it's gonna be growing more here in the future. And the number of online students, is that area of potential growth for us. And there are no online developmental courses in reading or writing. We don't have that. CORE is only for on-campus students, so online students don't have access to that type of instruction. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to go and look at this particular issue. So review of the literature. I feel weird back here. I'm gonna walk up a little bit more so I can be closer to all of you. So, what's that? If it was my own class, I would, but it would be nice to you today and not do that. So, all right, so podcasts are one of the issues that I'm looking at in here, and just kind of keep everybody on the same page, I wanted to put up a definition. There's actually a decent amount of research on the use of podcasts. So digital audiovisual files distributed over the internet to personal computers or mobile technology for instructional purposes. Most people tend to use them on what device? Phones, yep. So that's where you see them most often. The other terms that are often used in the literature are video podcasts or vodcasts. So you'll kind of see those used a little bit interchangeably. Oh yay, more people in the front, thank you. So 3 primary purposes of podcasts in instruction. So increased flexibility, they are on phones. So you can take them with you anywhere you want. You can listen to it whenever you want. There's a lot of flexibility in that sense. Increased accessibility, so again, computers, phones, tablets, all kinds of different devices they can be accessed on. It doesn't have to be one particular platform, so that's nice. And then enhanced learning experiences, especially for blended learning. And just for the sake of clarification, when I talk about blended learning, I mean face-to-face classes that also are using online components. So they're kind of using both modes of learning in that sense. So if you've seen these terms before, this is essentially what this refers to. So flipped classrooms, inverted classrooms. There's a lot of interesting things that people do with that, and I've seen people on campus doing some pretty cool things with this too. So now I'm going to ask you a question. And here's my question for you. So what are the different ways video can be used as a teaching tool outside of the classroom? So do you want to just answer, or do you want to take a minute to talk to people next to you? Yeah.
Narrated lectures.
Okay, yep, that's probably the most popular one is narrated lectures. What else? Yeah, Nancy. Student projects, absolutely. I've seen some pretty cool student projects done on video. What else? How about those online folks that do something every week? Anybody doing any of the weekly announcement stuff?
I post weekly announcements to summarize what the week is ahead, give students an idea of what the content is that they'll encounter in a general way, and then what they should expect for graded activities.
Okay. Anything else that you would add to that list that you've either seen other people do or that you do yourself? Yeah.
Feedback.
Feedback, yes. Actually, I know there's people doing that. Steve does some of that as well.
Delivery of content information through video clips, either YouTube or other sources that delivers content to students.
Yep, something already made that you don't have to go out and do yourself, which is great when that happens. So, yeah, is there one of, yeah,
I was
Carol?
just going to say modeling or examples
'Kay.
of content or its application.
So going through skills and showing students how to do specific things. So, yeah. So there's 6 primary types of podcasts when I was going through the literature, and this was kind of an interesting list, so I wanted to share it with you. This is the most popular, right? This is the one we probably see the most as lecture. And then we have feedback on assignments, which Nancy had mentioned. Additional or supplemental materials, which kind of goes along with maybe some of those YouTube clips and some other things that people use. Class preparation materials, something for students to look at before they come in for the lesson that day. And then improving technical skills, and that can be, like in my classes, I actually do actual tech skills with students sometimes. Here's how you do this on Canvas, here's how you do this in Google Calendar, those types of things. But it can also be very specific skills you have students working on as well. Content skills, that is. And then student-created podcasts, like Nancy had mentioned, so there's a lot you can do with that as well. For the purposes of the study and the research that I'm looking at, I wanted to look at kind of those 3 right there that are bolded. When you look at the literature on podcasts, the vast majority of it is on number 1. It's on lecture. So when I went through, I was having a hard time finding research that was actually done in the other areas. There's not a whole lot. There's quite a bit on number 1, so I wanted to work on filling in that research gap and seeing what I could do with the other pieces. So thinking about the pros and cons of video as an instructional method. This gentleman's name is Thomas Frank. I use his videos on occasion with my core students because he talks about things like this. Should you read your textbook? The answer is yes, but he goes through and explains it a little bit better. So it's kind of nice to go through sometimes. Sometimes students get tired of hearing me telling them they should be reading their textbook. Give them another perspective, let them hear somebody else talk about it. So his YouTube channel, in case you're curious, is College Info Geek. I don't agree with everything he does, but he's got some good things on there. So let's talk about this for a minute. So what are the pros and cons of using video? What works well and what is kind of a problem with it? Any thoughts on that one? Yeah.
Problem for me is when they're too long.
Yes.
Yeah.
The research that I've been looking at, they say the ideal time for something like that is probably 5-10 minutes, maybe 15 at the longest. So that's how they usually look at it when they look at those. What else? Yeah, Nancy.
I'm
And video, I can't go back and like find one little part of the video to remind myself about stuff. So that, I find that to be difficult if there's no transcript. So
Okay.
when I work with students, I often post a written transcript as well.
Okay.
So I can go back and find information.
So you're kind of creating a mental map as you go through and read versus having that be more difficult with video. Is that a way to explain it?
Well, and I don't like to see my face on the screen, so
I don't either.
do PowerPoint slides, which
Right.
means I have sort of a map already.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay, what else? Yeah.
I think accessibility can be an issue for
Mhm.
students that don't have a smartphone or internet at home. Or,
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And then there's sometimes some technical issues that come along with that, with the network or software or whatever happens to be going on. So there's those issues too. Yeah.
I have trouble with delivery because for me to be sort of animated and engaged, I have to be standing up in a classroom.
With people.
And it just, it disappears when I do videos. And
Mhm.
I haven't learned how to energize myself in my presentation.
I always feel really weird when I sit down to do a video because it's like, oh, the wall. That's really not exciting. How do I react? What do I do with my face? You know, Steve.
And there's also no immediate feedback then with
Yes.
people. And there's a point when you explain something in a way where people would have questions.
Mhm.
There's no immediate feedback. for
Yep.
it.
So no interaction, none of that type of stuff. What about some of the more positive things? How can they be useful, and why do some people choose to use them in their classes? Yeah.
I'm really reading and writing oriented, but I know 95% of my students are not.
Mhm.
And so I use video to engage them in the material, to give them pictures and audio. That just it's just a different way of learning it. I try to engage different learning styles.
Yeah.
For our
Yeah.
online students, it builds that connection to them. They really think we have,
Mhm.
it puts a name to a face in reality.
Absolutely, and that's certainly something we've learned kind of going through and doing this SIT or the Summer Institute with technology stuff. With online students, if they see your face, they get excited. They know who you are. They can see there's that connection. So that's important. And then they can come up to you and say, hey, this is great. And you'd be like, I have no idea who you are. I've never seen your face. But I guess that's what they tell me. So that happens. So, okay, so podcasts have a positive impact on student learning. Here are some of the things that the literature says. So active learning reduces extraneous cognitive load and student control of learning. And I'll talk about each of these kind of briefly. So active learning, I know a lot of you use active learning strategies in your classrooms, constructivist model, very student-centered. So it's not, someone necessarily just standing at the top, or, in front of the class and talking. People are interacting, doing things, doing activities. So helps increase all of these things: performance, engagement, critical thinking, attitude. And for me, the real key is this bottom part. The nice thing about using video to shift some instruction outside of the classroom means that I can do more active learning stuff with my students in the classroom. So I can tell them about a skill outside the classroom, but then help them develop that skill with me there next to them in the classroom. So that's the part that I really like about it. So cognitive load. There are 3 processes. So you're all sitting here right now. You have cognitive load going on. Pay attention to the presented material, so me and the slides. Mentally organizing that material and connecting it to your existing knowledge. So you're doing all of these things all at the same time. And then through doing that, if you have a high cognitive load, you're processing a lot of things while you're learning. Does that have a positive or negative impact on learning? It's negative, yep. So when you have high cognitive load, it has a negative impact on learning. So if you think about freshmen, of course, which is my population, they come in, they don't really understand yet how to take good notes. They don't know how to listen really well in lectures sometimes. They don't always do the readings they're supposed to do before they come to lecture or look at the materials you've given them. So they have all this stuff going on. So that's one of the things that I talk to my students about is, this is important. This actually helps you learn. Reduce this cognitive load so that when you're in class, you can focus better and actually learn more by reducing that cognitive load. So podcasts are one way to do that, which is kind of nice and helpful. So student control of learning, this is the one that through this research, students have given me some good feedback on this. So where they can view the material, when they can view it. You want to get up at 3 a.m., that's great. Whatever, come do that. Review it multiple times, and you'll see in the research this actually kind of bears out in the study that I did. Control the pacing, pause, rewind. Yes, they do listen to them at fast speed. Sometimes I slow it down. And then negative impacts, of course there are negative impacts. Lack of interaction, like Steve mentioned, not really kind of able to interact with the video. Can't ask questions. The time it can sometimes take, especially for the people who are making those videos, sometimes that takes time. Controlling the pace does mean more cognitive processing. So if you have a student sitting there deciding, did I understand that? Did I not understand that? Do I need to rewind? Do I need to fast forward? That is cognitive processing, so that does take a little bit. In the literature, interestingly enough, some students said they don't like the podcast because it takes them longer to get through the material because they slow down and pay attention and stop and rewind when they don't understand. Whereas if you're in class, things kind of keep going. So I thought that was an interesting point. And then, of course, technical issues like Naomi mentioned, those things are definitely a problem at times. And podcasts really still lack a strong theoretical foundation on best practices. They're still kind of a fairly new practice, so you can base it on kind of older stuff, but in and of themselves, there's not a whole lot there yet. And there's really not a lot of empirical research on the effectiveness of podcasts. So those are some things that I had looked at and learned through looking at the literature. So improving technical skills. This is one of those areas in the 6 types of podcasts that I wanted to look at, improving technical skills. This is the part that I wanted to look at specifically. So demonstrations and worked examples are the pieces I checked out. So they're step-by-step demonstrations of specific skills provided by content experts. Guess what subject area probably has the most research on that type of thing? Math, yeah. So if you're thinking about math, like how to work through a problem, what's there, but that happens in all content areas, right? There's always something you can work through, show students the steps and how that goes. So instructor can spend more time on content if the basic explanation is outside of class, or those types of things. Reduces that extraneous cognitive load, increases content comprehension, and significant short-term learning performance. So that's kind of an interesting thing to look at. So what types of worked examples do you feel could be beneficial for your own students? So what ideas can you guys come up with that? We've kind of mentioned math. You can talk about math more if you like, Steve. But what are some other possible demonstrations or worked examples you could do with your students? Or have done with your students? Yeah.
Well, thinking about,
Oh yeah, Mike, sorry about that.
so, I do videos for content, but I'm thinking in particular about, I teach Mrs. Dalloway, which is a stream of consciousness novel. A lot of students struggle to read it. And if I don't have students in front of me in class to help them get started with it, they may not even read more than a few pages. So I use it to demonstrate how to read it. So I go through and read a little bit. I highlight portions. I talk about the style that's happening, the technique being used, and help students see that there's sort of these multiple mental streams that are happening in the storyline, so that then when they go on by themselves, they can continue.
Thank you. What else? Rebecca's got one.
I do the, oh, sorry, Mike.
Sorry, we're forgetting the mic. We have to be nice to the people online.
I do this more with a video, but in my survey courses, I've learned that students don't read the way I read. And so part of what I do is to teach them strategies for reading a history textbook that help them with content. And so I'll do that in a video, and I'll basically work through a paragraph and show them how I mark it up, how I might write a margin comment. I'll pick a paragraph that has a few examples of things that I want them to focus on. And yeah, so I do that in a history class.
Can we do one more? We've got one more possibility.
Demonstrating the process of coding of qualitative data.
That's a good one.
Because that it seems so, without seeing it in action, it can seem incredibly overwhelming.
Thank you. So just kind of think what things you could use in your own classes. I'm sure a lot of you already do this. I've seen a lot of you doing this. So, but this is kind of what I wanted to focus on with this study. So since I'm doing literacy, the strategy that I chose to use was guided reading, which basically means, without necessarily reading all of that, is your reading process, like Rebecca had mentioned, it's in your head, it's invisible. Students can't see what you're doing when you read. So a guided reading basically means you go out with them and walk them through the steps of what you're doing as an expert reader in your content area, like as a historian or as a mathematician or as an educator, as a sociologist. So what do you do in your field when you read that helps them with those habits of mind? So that's what guided reading does. They're also known as think-alouds and modeling, just in case you're curious of the other words used in the literature. So I chose to use the guided reading, and really it's mostly because of this. So it makes invisible thinking become visible. That's really the key, especially with students who come in as freshmen, the struggling readers I work with. When I first teach them how to do text annotation, it's like someone has opened this whole world to them because they've never thought about interacting with the text. Do they just read it, their eyes go over it, they're done. And then they want to know why they don't understand it. So helping them see that thinking and how that works. So it's a type of demonstration or worked example, which I talked about with the literature. So in this study, the skill instruction that I chose to use for the study is main idea identification of a sociology article. So as we all know, different content areas, different disciplines do things a little bit differently. The classes that I had available to me were sociology classes, so we did sociology articles with that. Reasoning, some of you might like this reasoning. College students struggle to read professional journal articles. Does that sound familiar? Thought you might like that one. So they need explicit instruction on how to do this. And then of course, main idea aids in comprehension, so that was the second reason. So with this, I put everything together, online, in class, face-to-face learning, with guided reading, and through podcasts. So kind of taking a look at all of those things in the study. So the research questions were, do podcasts increase college student literacy learning through guided reading? And how do podcasts impact college student literacy learning through guided reading? So basically, do they? And if they do, how do they do that? So methodology, setting, rural Pacific Northwest. University of somewhere around 4,800 students. This, of course, is over the last 3 years, so those numbers fluctuate a little bit. Around 1,600 on campus, 3,200-ish online or on-site. 93% of our students, approximately, are on financial aid. Graduation rate over those that time period. Transfer rate, it's good to know that we have that type of transfer rate. And then a quarter system. Some of you may be very familiar with this type of an institution. Thought it might look familiar. So it's an introductory sociology course. For those keeping track, it was actually SOS 204. Rosemary was very generous and allowed me to do this study in her class. So 5 credits, meets 5 days a week, 50 minutes a day. Actually meets a ton of graduation requirements, which is really cool for that class. A lot of students get a lot out of that for graduation. And maximum enrollment is 60 students. One of the concerns doing this in a rural institution is getting a large enough sample size for the research. So I was trying to find classes that had higher enrollment to kind of do that. It was conducted one term each year over the last 3 years. So the first time I did it was spring 2014, then winter 2015, and this term now. In fact, students turned in the last papers last week. So I've been kind of crunching that data, getting it done. Participants, traditional, non-traditional, a lot of first-year college students in that introductory course. Volunteers, gave informed consent. Randomized groups. So those were the participants for this particular study. Mixed methods. This is the fun thing I get to say a whole lot today. 2-sample, 2-tailed t-test. I'm working on that. So we're looking at the overall scores that students were assigned for the particular assignments they did, as well as specifically the main idea score. So they were given 2 different scores for each assignment. And then semi-structured interviews and a participant survey at the end when we were done. So the timeline, because this was done over the course of 3 years, and the instructor is really good at dynamically moving the instruction to fit the needs of students, the timelines looked a little bit different. So just so you can kind of see when that worked. There was a pre-test, so paper 1. The instruction happened in those weeks. And then the post-test or paper 2 and the maintenance test. So you can kind of see the differences of where those appeared in the term. So here's what I found out. So do podcasts increase learning? So we have the overall score comparison of the papers, the main idea identification, semi-structured interviews, and the participant survey. So those are the pieces that I looked at to help answer this question. So the individual papers and the pre and post-test instruction. So I looked at all, paper 1 compared in class and online for paper 1, paper 2, paper 3 individually, and then looked at everything for paper 1 compared to post-instruction with papers 2 and 3. So with that, 2-sample, 2-tailed t-test. The p-value was 0.05. There were no statistically significant results on that one. So there was no, one wasn't better than the other in this particular case. The data didn't show that. For the main idea on the individual papers, again, a two-sample, two-tailed t-test, p-value 0.05. For this, papers 1 and 3, the first paper and the last paper did not have statistically significant results. However, paper 2 did. So the p-value for that was 0.02 on this one. And in this case, the in-class average for that score on those papers, it was out of 4, was a 2.64, and the podcast was a 3.11. So on this particular paper, the students who had the podcast learning did better in this case. Pre and post instruction, again, kind of the same things there, and no statistically significant results on that one. And one of the things I did, so the first time I did the study, I had around 36 participants. Each time I've gained around 30 more, trying to see if we can build that, but we still haven't come up with any statistically significant results on that one. So the semi-structured interviews. So the students, I interviewed about 7 students. The interviews were less than 15 minutes, did transcribing, coding, all of those things. So the in-class students, some of them said there was no learning, and their grade actually decreased for some of them. And information was not helpful because it was learned in high school. This particular participant went to a high school where it had really good AP classes, had learned all of this, and she came in, and that's one of the reasons why I interviewed her. So she actually had learned all this before she came and didn't find it useful. On the other side, in the podcast group, helped improve reaction paper grades, which is that specific assignment, but also helped them improve their reading journals, which is another assignment, regular assignment in the class. So they felt it wasn't just this one, it was that one as well. And then a senior that earned full points on all of their assignments, basically, he said he really wished that he had this as a freshman. He had it as a senior, he'd figured it out already, but if he'd had it as a freshman, he thought things would be a lot easier for him. So that was his comment on that one. Participant survey had a 70% rate of return. Since they finished their papers last week, I still might get a couple of those in. That'd be great, working on that. So 67 out of the 96 participants. And then, so one of the questions that I asked them was to rate how much they agree with this statement. The instruction on how to identify the main idea of a sociological article helped me to better understand the articles I read in Soc 204. So if you look at that, luckily no one strongly disagreed. So that's good. There were 4 in the in-class that disagreed, and then there's a large chunk of neither agree or disagree. For the agree and strongly agree, it was about 71% of the students who filled out the survey. So it's always nice to know when students feel like they appreciated the instruction. So for in-class participants, some of their comments on that survey, this is my favorite one, of course. There was a lesson? Yes, there was a lesson. So it's always fun when that happens. Instruction will impact their future work beyond that class and what they were doing. And then another senior, different from the other one, wanted the instruction as a freshman. So I actually had a senior tell me from both groups that they wanted to have that as a freshman. They had it now, but they thought it would be beneficial to have earlier. For those in the podcast, thought it was helpful. A couple students said that. Helped with reaction papers, but not the course as a whole. So that specific assignment, yes. Class as a whole, not so much. But and another student said that it helped make their papers overall more developed. So they appreciated having that and being able to do that. So how do they impact learning? For this, I looked at the interviews and the participant survey to help answer this question. So with the interviews, some of the students said they appreciated the additional approach to the assignment. And then expanding on professors' expectations. These are 2 things that I actually heard from multiple students. They appreciated the idea that the professor had given them the assignment, explained the assignment, and then they got another perspective on how to do that assignment. So I heard that a couple of different times, which led me to some other questions of if you're going to do something, is it nice to have you do it or someone else do it? I don't know. Sometimes I have someone else come in my class to explain something I know well because they'll listen better, depending. Guided reading improved the understanding of the assignment. In this particular case, the guided reading that I did, for those of you who are familiar with sociology, was C.W. Wright Mills' The Promise. It's from about the 50s, and it's tough for students to read. So that's one of the reasons we chose that one and did the guided reading with that. So they were happy to have that extra understanding on that difficult reading. Less distracting than live lecture. I thought this was interesting. They were actually in this room. Think about all the things and all the people going on, room pretty much full. There's a lot of distractions, a lot of things going on. So if they're doing the podcast, they're doing the podcast. They're not having all these other sensory things coming along. So for the interviews, the in-class group said the instruction was not helpful. And then another student said that it helps them think more out of the box and open my eyes. The podcast group, they really appreciated the self-paced learning, which we talked about. They talked about the visuals in the video. They liked having the visuals. Interestingly, the in-class group had the same visuals. And then review as needed and multiple times. And this is kind of an interesting one. And we'll talk about this in the next slide. So, excuse me. So in the survey, one of the things I asked them was how many times they viewed the podcast. So in this case, you can kind of see those along there, but almost 2/3 of the participants had multiple views. They viewed it mostly either 2 or 3 times. So a lot of them did go back and did look at it again. So that was kind of an interesting finding that actually agrees with what the literature says. So about 34 of the students out of the podcast group filled out that survey. And in more detail, 42% 2 times and 20% 3 times. So that's pretty good. So summary. So with the first question of does it impact things, overall score comparison didn't really show necessarily a whole lot, so there were no statistically significant results. Main idea, there is a possibility that podcasts can result in greater literacy learning on specific skills rather than overall, and that's possibly because of the paper too, but I don't think there's a whole lot there to generalize and say this is the case. So, the semi-structured interviews gave us more information on that, talked about how some students liked things, some didn't, and the participant survey. So research question 2, how does it impact? So the interviews, again, students said to open their eyes, they liked having another perspective on things, more understanding the expectations by going it over again. And the survey results, again, students watched it more than once, so hopefully they didn't do it just because, they usually don't go and do homework again if they don't want to. So it's not common. So limitations of this study, there were some things that I've been thinking about a lot in this study and what I can do better and how to maybe move forward with it. So first of all, it's a small sample size. Most of the research that's done in this type of thing is done at large institutions. So you have those classes of like 300-400 students. They're taught every term. And so people go through and do that research, for however many years, every single term with a ton of students. So that wasn't necessarily something I was able to do in this study. Instruction differed slightly. Of course, it was over the course of 3 years, so it wasn't quite exactly the same every time. And the podcasts were actually altered slightly to help adjust to what the professor had adjusted in their class to make sure things were still dynamic. Timeline differences, again, adjusting for each class and what they were doing. And a variety of articles. I absolutely love that this instructor gives student choice. We had, I think it was, when I counted it up for the 3 years, it was like 40 articles, which is great because they're fascinating articles, by the way. I had fun reading them. And then refining it, analyze the assessment tools. I'd like to hone the rubrics that I use to be able to do these analysis. An additional score for main idea identification. I did that part all myself, but I want to make sure it's not me making an error, essentially, have some other people kind of backing that up. Include main idea identification on the overall score rubric. They were actually 2 separate rubrics that got scored. Each paper got scored twice, so that will help with efficiency. And then same scores for all elements, possibly. And maybe limit the number of articles. So further research possibilities that come out of this. So literacy instruction and podcasts, there's really not much in the research about literacy and podcasts. Those two don't show up very often. It's usually a lot, more math and that type of stuff. Larger sample size, longitudinal research. I did this once a year for 3 years, but it was really only like 3 terms. So I'd like to see a more long-term study on this type of thing. Impact over multiple assignments and skill growth, and then assessment method. Back to that idea of student-created podcasts. I find that really fascinating. If you're going to use podcasts as an assessment method, how much more does that help deepen their understanding if they're producing that type of a thing? So Rural Research Site, we've talked about this a little bit. Any thoughts on how to get around that issue, do you think? I'm asking you on that one. Any thoughts on rural research and doing this type of research in a small institution?
I think you might develop some more qualitative approaches that you might develop some more qualitative approaches that wouldn't depend on large numbers but could go deep in terms of individual learning with more specific kinds of conclusions that students might reach?
Okay. Well, I forgot to mention I'm asking this because this is really the first study I've done, so I need your help. Help me figure out where to go next. So, any other thoughts on that one?
I'm kind of wondering by the senior year if they would connect some of that early learning with skills they acquire. You know, I mean, I wonder if you could track a few students through the 4 years that they're here.
I like that idea. Any other thoughts on that one? Okay. Oh, one more back.
I wonder, along with tracking those students, if you can look for transfer to see if this works across classes, across disciplines.
And with what I do, that's especially important. My class is to help them do well in your class. So, okay. So another thing, this one for me, of course, is why I kind of wanted to look at this in the first place. The idea of first-year literacy instruction and looking at ways that we can help students with that, in particular online students who don't necessarily get the type of support that our on-campus students do. So that's something I'm thinking about. If you have ideas on that, you can let me know. And then thinking about things that are best taught in the classroom. I mean, yes, podcasts are great, you can do a lot with them, but that doesn't work for everything. Not everything is gonna go that way and transfer very well. So just kind of thinking about the things that don't work that way, what are those, and maybe why? Because that'll kind of help inform things a little bit. And then differentiation. One of the things that one of the students I interviewed mentioned is that she really wanted to have more videos. So like we did main idea of a sociology article. She wanted one from me. She wanted one from like maybe 2 other people or 2 or 3 other articles. So kind of showing multiple examples of the same skill to help students see different approaches, which seemed like a pretty good idea to me. I've seen some people doing that in their classes, and that's working out pretty well, I think, for some people. The other thing too is, of course, with differentiation and using this type of technology, students can go at their own pace. It's back to that idea of doing your own learning or controlling your own learning, so that helps as well. So recommendations for educators in general from the things that I found. Explore podcasts in your own context. You know, so how does it work in your own discipline? What are you doing that's working? What ideas might you have to do some other things? Use of worked examples. This really, to me, is way more important than the podcast thing, just demonstrating to students what we do, which I know you do all the time. Self-pacing and choice, and how important that is for students, and differentiation. And then multiple examples. I really like that idea of having a skill and having maybe multiple videos of that when we can get time to make all of those multiple videos, right? And maybe there's ways that we can team up with that, possibly. That's something to think about. So for me, video creation, I get a lot of questions doing the tech stuff that I do. I have a lot of people asking me about video creation. I did a variation of this presentation at the College Reading and Learning Association, and part of it was on actually creating things. So people come to me and say, Liz, how do I do this? How do I make this thing using technology? And this is not a crack on our IT people, just so you know. But this is what I do most of the time. So what my friends think I do, my mom, society, my boss, what I think I do, what I actually do. So when people ask me, Liz, how do I do this thing with this specific program that I really want to do? Really, I go there first a lot of times. My favorite thing is YouTube. Type in YouTube and what you want to do, and it'll give you a video of exactly what you want to do most times. And if it doesn't, there's a lot of people around campus who can help you with that. So if you're thinking about those things. And at that conference, I just wanted to show you this. If you want this, I'm more than happy to email it to you. But one of the things I did in my presentation was have the audience generate a list of video apps and software that they use. So this is that list, and if you have any questions on that, I'm more than happy to send that to you. But just for ideas, they had a lot of ideas, which I appreciated. And now you can ask me whatever you want. So, and I'll come up here. Steve's got your mic.
Questions?
You look like you have one, Steve.
I'm trying to formulate it, but
Okay.
he's got his hands up.
He's gonna ask me, I'll try asking first.
Okay. By the way, Peter, I'm sorry there are no cookies, but there are brownies.
I've already had
Okay. That's the first thing he asked me when I told him.
2 quick questions, if it's okay. First, do you have any thoughts on why scores kind of increased in the middle and those students fell back to the other group?
Mm-hmm.
And the other is, I agree we do want to have them read the textbook.
Yeah.
And I worry sometimes that this kind of thing will give them yet another excuse not to read the textbook. So, you know, is there any guidelines in terms of the right mix of podcast and textbook, or does in fact more of this mean less of that? I don't know.
Okay. First question. So, you know, like I said, I've done this 3 times. The first time that I did it, interestingly enough, paper 3 was statistically significant, so the very last one. So my initial conclusion on that was that, you know, long term, it helped with long-term learning. But as I went through and did the study 2 more times, that was not true. So that wasn't the case. So as far as the bumping kind of up and down, I think part of it has to do with the sample size too. So there's a lot of kind of different things going on there, kind of the instruction happening at different points and times a little bit. But there's not, to me, there's not quite enough data yet to have something that's solid. And so because there's not enough data, things just fluctuate more. And then as far as balancing reading and videos and podcasts, that's something I think about a lot. My students are like, I don't want to read, but you want to be a better reader, right? Yes, then you have to read. So, yeah.
So we give them podcasts.
Yes, we can, well, that's actually an issue that comes up sometimes in the high schools. I was actually part of a team that created what we called non-traditional history, which meant that it was for students who don't like lecture and reading. It was a lot more hands-on, those types of things. And it was an interesting class. We did a lot of cool things with it, but looking back, knowing what I now know about literacy, it worries me. Because those students who have low reading skills weren't reading. They were doing other things. And so, you know, I tell my students, if you want to be good at football, what do you have to do? You have to practice. If you want to be good at reading and writing, what do you have to do? You have to read and write. And it's something that kind of becomes a mantra for me, and they get sick of hearing me say it. And I use other things besides football, but, you know, my students don't want to read and write because they're not good at it. So they don't typically want to do those things. And so convincing them that that's something they want to do, to me, the videos are a way to differentiate and allow them to learn those skills at their own pace, because there's such a wide spectrum with the students that I teach that allows them to do it how they want to do it and then go into the reading and do that piece of it. Does that kind of answer that for you? Okay. Bless you.
This may be too big a question, but I just wondered if you approach things differently with people who are second language, for whom English is their second language.
I think this has a lot of possibilities for that. In the field of literacy and second language, those types of things, when students can hear things and read them at the same time, that's something you can think about. So like, one of the things I've been looking at a lot lately is audiobooks to help students, because when you can read the book and hear it, the fluent reading at the same time, that helps students improve their reading skills. So that's kind of one example. It's a little bit different because it's audiobooks, but I think there's a lot of possibility with that, and helping second language learners hear things, see things, you know, multiple sensory, that helps. So this is one way that you can do kind of the multiple sensory thing and do it at their own pace.
I had an experience with a student last year who is a fluent speaker in Spanish and reads beautifully out loud, but I came to find out she didn't have a clue of what she was reading.
Yes.
And it was a real wake-up call for me, because we make these assumptions. Well, you speak perfectly, but the comprehension isn't there. And for people who didn't grow up, with books in a household, or with parents who were literate, for example, they're truly first generation.
And that definitely happens in your home language as well.
Right, exactly.
So I know a lot of you are familiar with that too. So.
I want to, like Peter had two.
You can have two.
So one thing that I've tried, excuse me, a couple times is, I'm worried about that too, that students don't read. So you can try to incorporate a reading exercise into a podcast where you might be lecturing and then talking about a concept, and then you can do in the podcast, you can say, now we're going to go to page 87, read through this paragraph, and have them do a writing assignment, whatever your prompt may be. They load that up online, you can read it and give them feedback. And it's one way to, well, for lack of a better word, force them to read, and then you can embed it in the podcast. So that's one idea that might be helpful. Your other comment I thought was interesting about people asking you how to do these things, because there are a lot of ideas that I see that I would like to try, but I simply don't have time. To teach myself. And it seems like having, say, for example, the CTLA sponsor you in doing a workshop or something like this, I bet a lot of faculty would be interested, and you could teach these skills to us, and then we have the ability to go back and start using these in the classroom. I would love to see something like that.
There's always the Summer Institute, so, yep. Yeah, if people are interested in that, that's certainly something you can talk to people in CTLA about, when we can discuss it and see what works. If we know what you want, we're happy to provide that. So.
Just connected to Rebecca's comment, a few years ago, Stanford University did this massive online artificial intelligence class.
Oh, yeah.
And I actually took part in that.
Okay.
And one of the useful things they did in that class was, after every video lecture, they had this little embedded quiz at the end that was, you have to solve a problem related to the ideas that you just learned about. So that sort of forced things to be a little more interactive, and I wonder if you could do something similar to that to sort of compel a little bit of short reading at the end of a podcast in order to answer some question that connected to the ideas.
I like that. That's certainly something that can be done. Do you have your question yet, Steve?
I've decided to withdraw it.
Ah, okay.
So I'm not sure that this is an answerable question, but I'm a learner who cannot I can't process auditorily. So I'm wondering, and I really hate learning on videos because I can't write on them like someone said earlier. I'm wondering if you hear that from students that like, I'm sure there's like a few weirdos like me that want to read their book and like write on it. But is there, with everything moving towards like podcasts and stuff, I don't know. I'm just wondering what the conversation is about that, I guess. There's just too few of us to care.
Well, I will say with the student population I work with currently, that's not something that comes up often for me. But the nice thing about this, though, is it helps you differentiate. So if you have students who learn better that way, they can go and do the reading. If you have students who learn better with the video, they can do the video. It is a little bit more time on the part of the instructor, but once you have it set up, that's helpful too. And you can kind of build. What I've learned in my classes is take the pieces I want to do. So if I want to add the podcast, don't do them all at once, because that's painful. But just sort of add them in piece by piece and add in the readings, and what you want to do with those other types of learning piece by piece, so that you can eventually have what you want and differentiate for all the different types of learners.
So you would provide the same material in multiple modalities for them eventually someday?
Yeah. It takes time, but I think it's something that can eventually be done, yeah. Depending on the content and what it is.
I'm just thinking about this because you did this with my class, and the spring classes should do better than the fall classes, because at least in my experience, students have mostly taken Writing 121 sometime in the year, and then they come to my class and they have some ability to engage, and that many in the fall didn't have as much. So I'm a little puzzled at the first year. I think it was a fall one.
Well, it was spring the first year.
Spring? So there was a fall one, though, was
Nope,
no
we ended
fall.
up not doing fall.
Well, then I don't even have anything to say.
That's okay. I'm all right with that.
There was winter.
There was a winter, yes.
But I was also thinking about all the different variables that take place that we put limitations on being able to generalize about this. And it could be as simple as I scheduled another assignment a little too close to that one, and they didn't read it, and they were in a hurry, and they didn't do very well, and they didn't bother to really read it. They knew how to get the main idea, but they didn't want to do the rest, so they lost those points.
I did ask them in the survey how much of the articles you read. I don't know if I've shown you that yet. I can do that. One of the questions, paper 1, paper 2, paper 3, I read all of it. I read most of it. I read half of it, not half of it. And I got it was interesting to look at the answers with the data, which I don't have in this presentation right now, but that was kind of fun to look at, actually. I will share that with you so you can see it.
Very much of it,
some of them, no. And some of them definitely told me they read everything and they had those scores. So I don't know. So. I love not being the instructor and asking students questions. They tell me interesting things.
I just wanted to
And they
watch
love
Steve
her,
walk
so.
across the room here, making his, no,
There you go.
You know, I'm just thinking, because I watch my own daughters on their phones, and maybe it's not so much about audio, video, whatever, text, but just, I think there's more processing going on with people looking at their phones than there used to be. And when I think about doing that, there's a whole lot more distraction. It's hard to bury myself in a phone versus a book or a computer screen or something else. And I'm wondering, is there any research that suggests that there's a difference in the quality of processing of information depending on the mode or the medium?
Okay. I'm guessing there probably is. I don't have that necessarily in my head at this point, but I know there has been some research done on like e-readers versus books, so that's something that's out there. As far as phones and like versus computers, I'm not aware of it. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, of course. There was a class that I sat in on at one point this year, and I watched a student type his paper on his phone, and it really freaked me out. I'm like, how are you, he just wrote this multi-page paper the whole time, just typing it on his phone, and I'm like, oh, he's in Google Docs, and I'm like, you know, but they're doing that. That's what I have students who are trying to do entire classes on their phones and not picking up a computer and not picking up a tablet or anything like that. So that's something that is out there and students are doing. So I'm not sure the impact of that versus other devices, but that's a good question to go in and look at. So.
It seems like the phones are the prominent device now.
Yeah.
It's the rare student who brings a notebook computer to class. It's the it's even rarer to have students bring tablets.
Yeah.
But they all come to class, and that's what they're on before you start to talk.
And I used to teach in a school district in Wyoming. Of course, it had lots of money, so they all had MacBooks. So I got to do a lot with my students on the MacBooks, but of course now I don't have that, but they all have their phones. And I survey my students every term. Right now, I think I'm up to at least 90% of students having a smartphone. I think the last bigger class I had, it was everybody but one student. So of course you deal with that and make sure it's equitably done. But there are ways to use phones in class too, which has been interesting to play with.
I think it would be really interesting. I don't know if you in your survey included a question about on what device the students listen to the podcast on, or their familiarity or sense of self-efficacy with that device. Just because, like, I guess a question or something this is making me think about is we know that students do better when they have higher sense of self-efficacy, right? So their belief in their own ability to learn actually improves their ability to learn.
Yes.
So I just wonder if that's part of the effect of watching podcasts, if that's a medium that introduces some sense of self-efficacy to start with, or if the device that they're using introduces that element, if it could amplify the effects of that learning or not. I don't know.
I really like that question. I didn't have it on this survey, and I feel like I said, I started the study about 3 years ago, and that was really, but like that was about the time I started to notice my students having maybe more tablets or maybe more mobile devices with what I was doing. But it's definitely something that I would include if I did it again, because I think that's a really good question to figure out what they're actually using it on.
One of the interesting things that you can think about for future as well is, as much as you're teaching students how to read, you may have to teach students how to watch videos in an interactive way. And
yeah.
Because right now we sit and we watch a movie all the way through, and one of the things I talk about in early childhood is we have to stop, talk about what we just saw, get the children to talk about it. So we may have to teach our students how to do the same thing with videos.
I used to work with a gentleman who was a history teacher, and we called it the long video method because his name was Mr. Long, and it worked out. But he'd go through a video with students, and it'd take him forever because they'd do so much conversation while they were watching the video, and they'd stop and they'd do activities and talk about things. So when students had a movie, they weren't just like, movie, they're like, oh, we got to do a lot of work. So it was pretty fun to watch, actually.
Any other questions?
Ray's not going to harass me?
I'm going to be kind.
Okay, thanks.
I got him under control.
Oh, I thought that couldn't happen.
Liz, as students become self-reliant upon podcasts, are we doing them a disservice for when they go to graduate school?
That's a good question. I would say the thing that I think I would argue for is not to always use podcasts, but just use it very selectively on things that it works for. That's possible. What I find is that with my freshmen, I find myself kind of going into graduate mode sometimes, like, oh, they don't need all that quite yet. But looking at what is a scholarly article, how are they set out, which may not be quite a freshman skill sometimes, But doing all those things, what I've watched is that the technology is seeping up, if that makes sense. And I don't know how much it's going to be in graduate school, but I think it's going to get there. And I think people are going to be doing things there, you can argue whether or not that's appropriate, I guess. But I think there will be more of it. So kind of back to what Rayette was saying about teaching students how to use different types of media for learning. Maybe that's something we should be doing, but I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question. But.
Take one more. Or none at all.
One more.
I got him started.
Since you are varying your instructional modalities, have you felt it necessary to also vary your assessment formats?
Yes.
And in what way have you done that?
Right now, my concern with assessment in the classes that I teach is trying to mirror what they're going to see in other classes. So that's really my primary focus right now. When I first came into the program, students weren't doing any kind of exams, and so they didn't understand the process of getting ready for a final. What does that mean? You know, those the kind of high stakes tests. But I also do things in my class, you know, with group work and different types of projects. You know, it's not just assessing through exams. There's other ways as well. But with the job that I have to make sure they're also ready for those exams. So, does that help? Okay.
Three's a charm, right?
No. Three's retirement.
Three's retirement.
It's time to go fishing.
Well, if there are no more questions, let's give Liz a hand. We'll bring the 2015-16 Colloquium Series to an end. Snacks in the back. Thank you very much for coming and have a good summer.